pretty full already. There are maybe 2 seats available. We don't want to kick out anyone who wants to be here. Sure, we'll find some space. Okay, so with that said, hello and welcome to the Decoupling and Fragmentation panel. My name is Paulina Kintzinger. I'm a junior researcher at the Kiel Institute, the Christoph Trebisch, and I'm very honored and pleased today to welcome Şebnem with the Price of Fragmentation. And you have, just to quickly explain the rules again, you have 20 minutes, and then the discussion has 10 minutes, and then we have 10 minutes for a Q&A, and I will hold up these cards and be a bit annoying with that. So thank you very much for being here, and we can start, I think.
So this is working now, and you can hear me, right? Great. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting us to present this paper at this amazing conference. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit late. I arrived this morning, but there's insane traffic out there in Berlin because apparently Biden also arrived, both coming from DC, although I came through Frankfurt, not through Air Force One. But anyway, so it took me some time to get here, but I am very happy that I'm here. I also want to apologize our discussant because he never got a paper. I mean, this paper is being written as we speak. We are writing it right now. There is no paper yet. So he got series of slides from us, like in a repeated order. So he graciously bear with us. So I really, thank him for that. And I'm looking forward to his comments and all of your comments. This is the first presentation debut of this paper. So the paper is joined with a bunch of people from the Federal Reserve System. So just the usual disclaimer applies, and these are our views. Let me start with this slide. So the starting point of this paper is taking the stock of facts produced so far on geopolitical fragmentation by many of you in this room, next room, and also outside this conference. So far, our understanding, reading this literature, basically tells us that bilateral trade has fallen, but not global trade. So this is basically, you might see less of a trade between US and China, but that is really reallocating through connector countries like Vietnam. Several papers are on this. I cite a few here, but this seems to be a pretty robust fact. Accompanying this fact, there's also a similar pattern in FDI, where, things go through affiliates in Vietnam and other countries, also bilateral portfolio flows via, financial centers like Luxembourg. This has been happening before too, but, intensified. Again, I cite papers here. There's a lot of work from the IMF on this, and academics. So basically the idea is there is this geopolitical tension, and this is influencing cross-border trade and investment. But it's not just a cross-border story, as we also learned from the work of Pierre-Olivier, Gita, and André and Petya, that there's also a lot of action going within sectors. Also, Laura's work shows us that a lot going on within firms. And this is not just based on trade data or, investment data. There's also some very, genius papers using real-time shipping data, AI-based data. All are telling us the same story. So far, fragmentation seems to be unfolding as a reconfiguration, right? Not a reduction or not like complete, cancellation of globalization, but a reconfiguration of trade, supply chains, incentivized by uncertainty, and reallocation of capital among friendly countries. Okay, so we start from this point and ask a very simple question. Should central banks care about this? I mean, you might think central banks would want to know the long-run impact of this reconfiguration of trade and capital flows on income and prices. And we have, already quantitative trade models in the literature that can use to calculate this impact together with welfare implications. What we want to argue in the paper is transition to new steady state in the short run is also important, because in the short run there can be inflationary pressures and unemployment. In fact, this short-run impact of fragmentation can be salient given the many relative price changes along the global production and trade network. We saw a lot of evidence of that during COVID. In fact, we have another paper explaining the drivers of pandemic-era inflation by using a very similar model that we are going to use in this paper. So what we are going to do, what is our contribution, is to get a global general equilibrium IO view of aggregate fluctuations, look at the short-run impact using the trade and production network. We start with a given initial IO matrix and then apply trade costs. So this is going to help us to endogenize the reconfiguration of adjustment, capital flows, trade through obviously intensive margin with CS, but that is consistent with what literature so far telling us in terms of how fragmentation is shaping. So we are going to estimate inflationary impact together with the sectoral employment changes depending on country blocks. Now we are going to do different country blocks, and we are going to do that based on, again, all these papers I showed you in the first slide that tells us, how this reconfiguration happening, who are the friendly countries, how it is traveling around and all that. So we are going to take that given from those papers, and then we are going to have the model estimate these things. So it's basically take our previous model that we study pandemic era inflation and we introduce trade shock. So this is a two-period multi-country, multi-sector model. Every country is going to have an access to a domestic bond in local currency and a world bond in the world currency, which will be dollars. So monetary policy in every country is going to pin down by Taylor rule. There is going to be downward nominal wage rigidity in home currency. And the key friction is going to be segmented factor markets. Both labor and capital is going to be segmented both domestically and also globally. Now, our work is distinct but complementary to other work that look at how geopolitical-led reconfiguration led to output losses, real income losses. There's also work that shows us fragmentation can be resulting as an optimal response from countries' responses to each other under coercion. So we are complementing all these body of work, which is very, very influential, basically by focusing on a key issue that every single central bank cares about, which is inflation-unemployment trade-off. Okay, and as a proof of concept, I would like to show you this figure. In the absence of trade costs, this model that we are using can match the pandemic-era inflation very well. You can see this is the inflation from 2020 to 2022. You can extend to 2023, United States on the left, euro area on the right. The black line is actually observed inflation. And the model is the diamonds, does a pretty good job without targeting anything, just feeding in the pandemic era shocks. And the only 2 quarters where the model misses is this extreme events of lockdown and the rebound. So model does pretty good job of catching the price changes. Okay, let me go through quickly the model structure. So the macro model, the intertemporal part of the model is going to be very straightforward. 2 periods, you can see the utility function for every country. N is the country, 0 is the first period, 1 is the second period. So there's going to be this B and domestic bond in local currency. F, there's a US dollar-dominated world bond traded internationally. Exchange rate is going to be between country N and the US. There's a domestic interest rate and the US interest rate. So this optimality here is going to give us 2 conditions, the standard Euler equation obviously on the top, and then the second is the UIP condition that we assume holding. So you can see the bilateral exchange rate is going to be given with the interest rate differentials, but there's also going to be Taylor rule pinning down those interest rates. So the shock and the change structure is very simple in this model, right? I mean, it's a hat algebra. Basically, you give all the shocks in the first period, and then you go back to steady state. So we look at these deviation from the steady state for every variable, and that's going to be this x hat. Okay. So world expenditure is going to be endogenous object, which is going to be very important because of the global general equilibrium view. So it's in dollars and endogenous, and it's going to be determined by, as you see on the slide, with the intertemporal shifters and the monetary policies. Bilateral exchange rate, as I told you, is going to be a function of the stance of the domestic monetary policies in US and the other country. And then domestic monetary policy is going to follow a Taylor rule in every country. So inside this macro intertemporal shell, there's going to be a very, very rich, granular, disaggregated micro model. So there's going to be several bundles, like several layers of CES. Consumption bundle is going to be consisting of country-specific sectoral consumption bundles as standard in these models. This is going to be formed by varieties, groceries, cars, and all that, aggregated with Armin elasticities. Production is going to have a similar disaggregated structure. It is going to be done by value-added and intermediate bundle. Value-added composes labor and capital, as you see at the end. And intermediate bundle, of course, is something that is going into different industries and we source from everywhere in the world. So specifically, intermediate bundle is going to be this Z. Remember, N is the country, I is the sector of country-specific bundles, and that is going to be, again, an arming aggregator of sector-specific bundles. So if you think J is the still, to give an example, coming from country M1 to N, many countries to US, still comes from China, Brazil, Turkey into US. US takes the still and uses it as an intermediate input in many industries like car, construction, and so forth. Okay, so all this structure is modeled. Okay, how do we enter the trade cost? Trade costs are going to be a tax on the price. Prices are endogenous. Everything is going to be non-linearly sold and endogenous in this model. So country N is going to place an ad valorem trade cost on MJ, right? Country industry MJ, that's going to be given by tau. Once country N puts this tau, this trade cost, that's going to show up obviously in all input prices. So you can see in the first equation on the consumption bundle and in the second equation in the price index for the sector-specific sectoral bundles. Okay, so that's how the trade costs come in. So tariffs and iceberg cost is going to be equivalent here, so just think this as a higher input price. In fact, we just heard from Janet Yellen today. She's talking exactly about this. Accelerating this is going to be inflationary. So this is what we will be also showing in the paper. Okay, the model is sold through market clearing. Goods market are going to clear, final goods C, intermediate goods X. Remember, I told you factor markets are segmented. Both capital and labor are going to be segmented. But of course, it's going to matter in the factor when there's a nominal rigidity, and that's the labor market. There's a downward nominal wage rigidity, and that's in local currency. So this is Mexico, that's going to be in peso. So the pink W bar is going to be the downward nominal wage rigidity in peso, and then the green stuff is the dollar world numeraire. So we are going to write this two constraint as the labor cannot go over the L bar, inelastic labor supply, and the wage cannot go below W bar, as you see in this equation. So their multiplication has to be 0. So we are going to use the standard technique in open economy to do this, and basically this is going to be an important friction in the model. Now, like I said, capital markets are all segmented, but there's no rigidity in the capital markets, so capital is going to be at the steady state capital for every country, every sector, and country, I sector. And the asset markets are going to clear. The countries are going to allow to have current account deficits and surpluses, but obviously it's going to clear. Okay, I don't have time to show you the details, but basically this model is going to be solved non-linearly. I'm going to show you results out of that solution, but before doing that, let me show you this linear approximation that comes out of the model for inflation, because this is going to give you a very clear intuition. So the model is going to deliver you an equation for inflation, D log CPI N, in every country, right? I'm going to show you the version without trade costs, which is what you see in the slide, and then I'm going to show you the version with trade costs. Now, without trade costs, there's going to be standard terms in this equation like world expenditure, exchange rate, productivity shock, but also some unstandard terms like factor changes and local global demand-supply imbalances. These things can going to be inflationary or deflationary depending which way they are going. Some usual stuff like productivity shocks are going to be deflationary, positive productivity shocks wherever they are, and things are going to be weighted according to input-output metrics, how much those goods are consumed in the consumption basket of the country. That goes in CPI. So world expenditure is again going to capture US monetary policy, countries intertemporal shifters, exchange rate is going to be vis-a-vis the US. All these things are also, going to be solved endogenously in the model. Productivity shock, your standard things, although we are not going to do any productivity shocks here. The only shock is going to be the trace cost shock. Factor changes they have this interesting negative sign in front of them. That means when labor goes down, when there's unemployment minus, that's an inflationary impact. And then, of course, local global demand supply imbalance, the last term is inflationary, meaning if everybody wants iPhones and iPhone using semiconductors and chips, that's going to be and if there is a imbalance globally in the chip and semiconductor production, that is inflationary in your country. That's this last term, that is what last term tells me. All right. Then we add the trade cost. So all that equation I showed you stays, and you have this additional pink term. That's the direct effect of the trade cost multiplied by the input-output matrix and the local donor weights. You see that's an element-by-element multiplication with tau. So tau here is going to be, of course, depending on, it goes to which sector, electrical cars, semiconductor, whatever. It multiplies and then sum up. So there's going to be this direct impact of trade cost. Of course, trade cost is also going to go through factor changes and the local global demand supply imbalance, because everything adjusts. All the prices and quantities adjust endogenously once the trade cost is put. All right, let me show you the results. Okay, we are going to divide the world in blocks, right? So we start very simple. We are going to say there are 5 blocks. Well, United States allies, China allies, and the rest of the world. So it is, we don't make this up. We take this exactly from those papers. I cited in the first slide. This is what those papers are telling us, how the blocks are forming. We take that as is. The color coding here tells you how much more input linkage you have with the other part of the other blocks, like the dark blue. So if actually ironic that United States and China, the most spoken countries, have the least amount. And the arrows going to show you the direction, and the thickness of the arrows also going to show you the extent of this intermediate input trade. So we are going to start with 2018 IO table from OECD. It's going to give us all these variables and start with the initial trade imbalances. Then we'll use empirically relevant trade and production elasticities from the literature, other parameters, standard Taylor rule parameter, and we pin down the intertemporal shifter to get the 1% interest rate in the steady state. So what is the trade shock we fit? The only weight here and only shock we fit is the trade shock. What is an empirically relevant trade cost shock to put? We are going to show you a range, and most of the results with 50%, because some sectors are going to be 100%, right? This is the electrical cars, now 100%, semiconductors 50%. So this is a little bit all over the place, and actually the framework is flexible enough that we can enter it exactly as they are. Right now, as the first cut, we are going to show you a whole range from 10 to 100, and then do the benchmark results with 50. So as I told you, it is a nonlinear solution. You normalize everything at 1, and then you introduce these taus, these trade shocks, then calculate relative prices in world expenditure units, convert to local currency with the exchange rates. Using these 5 blocks means that we are collapsing that 65 country, 66 sector IO matrix to 5 blocks and 16 sectors. That's what is going to happen when you do these blocks. And then 3 scenarios: US and US allies put on China, China and China allies put on US, 50% of trade costs, and then full trade war retaliation, everybody on everybody. First, let me show you that term in that linearized approximation to inflation. Remember, when we put the trade cost, there is this direct effect of trade cost. Just what that term gives us, you can see that the x-axis is the trade cost here from 5 to 200%. With small trade cost, not much. You are going to have negligible inflation. But if you go to 50%, 60%, I mean, it's getting sizable, right? In China, it's around over 2%. In US, it's like 1.1%. So there is some meaningful action here. Then we do the nonlinear solution and say, okay, let me look at the 50% case. And all these cases, when US puts it, US and US allies puts it, China puts it, and so forth. If you look at the last line, the full trade war line, which I just showed you, the linearized version, so here you see numbers are a little bit smaller, like United States 0.6, there it was like 1. Why is that? Why linearized effects are higher and nonlinear effect is lower? Because this, of course, allows the adjustment of the entire input-output matrix and the linkages, expenditure, prices, everything with the demand going down. So inflation is also going to down. That's the beauty of this model. You can bring both the demand side and the supply side. Demand is, of course, going to go down, not just as a response to higher price, but also because the monetary policy is going to react to inflation. Okay, I have 3 minutes, so this is different shock. So you can see going from 10% to 90%. Again, if 50 is your benchmark, in pink in the middle, is going to increase inflation numbers a lot. What is very interesting finding for us is the unemployment numbers. So there's aggregate Keynes unemployment here. This is 50% trade shocks. Again, actually, this table just shows everybody is wrong, right? Everybody is doing these things to bring jobs, to their country. I mean, China, buy in China, made in China, China employment, US, buy in, made in US, US employment. Well, this is actually, everybody's getting unemployment. Depending on who puts the trade cost, it's going to change, and depending on the network, but it seems like China and China allies are going to be affected more in terms of unemployment because, of course, they source more inputs internationally. And these effects are heterogeneous. Here you can see how US allies and China allies are going to be both hurt, especially in sectors like mining and oil, depending on the full trade war. Okay, let me conclude. So what the paper is telling you is actually there is going to be inflationary impact with this trade war. And of course, monetary policy is going to react to that. And the cost of stabilizing that inflation is going to be higher unemployment in a fragmented world. Now, in the US bloc or the US allies, inflation doesn't go as much, but unemployment goes up to 2% to 8% in sectors, especially that are sourcing a lot of intermediate inputs. The numbers are higher for the China bloc being China and China allies. Now, when you look at the aggregate numbers, the US unemployment can be up to, and US allies includes Germany, 1.5%, up to 4.5% in the China case. This is the worst case scenario if you have a 90% trade shock. So far, we are seeing it in, for example, electrical car industry. Now, all these results are from a two-period global general equilibrium network model with wage rigidity. We like the wage rigidity and general equilibrium global network because that is going to give us this big advantage of studying spillovers of a trade policy in one country, in US or China, on the third country's output inflation trade-off. So it matters for the third country's central bankers. Standard open economic macro will miss that. And this is also going to allow us to analyze the link between countries' comparative advantage and sector-targeted industrial policies and tariffs. Of course, the caveat is that it's two-period. We cannot talk about dynamics or persistence of inflation and so forth. So that is going to be the next step. But we believe this model highlights very well the importance of demand and supply adjustments during this fragmentation process that we are going to go through. This is different than your standard trade IO models, which works with productivity shocks. Here, monetary policy contracting the aggregate demand is going to have an effect both on inflation and employment, where inflation is driven by this cost push shock as a result of fragmentation. And we are now working on the full dynamic model. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Şebnem Kalemli-Özcan. And now we're welcoming Francesco Zanetti to discuss this paper. And you have 10 minutes. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to, it's a pleasure to discuss this paper. I didn't receive it, but the slides were sufficient for me to hopefully give you some comments. Before I go ahead, I want to highlight that I did this presentation with one of our students in Oxford who will be on the market probably in a couple of years, but this is just to signal that there are some good stuff on this topic and young people working on these topics in Oxford. So, here, let me give you first a summary of the paper, and then I'll make 5 remarks. And the summary is, the presentation was quite clear. Basically, the premise here is that there was a fall in bilateral trade between US and China, but not in total trade. And this fall in trade was also mirrored by a similar developments in portfolio flows and foreign direct investments. So there is a relationship between quantity and prices that it is interesting. Bilaterally, they go down, but globally, they stay up. And also, the observation is that by this very process, there is a lot of trade fragmentation. This paper kicks in and says, well, what is the impact of these trade fragmentations that arises from trade costs on inflation and unemployment in the US and elsewhere? And then the second twist of the paper, the second question, was to think about monetary policy. And here, as I will remark later on, is that the focus here is on unemployment and inflation, but for monetary policy, we may need an extra step. Should monetary policy behave differently when we have fragmentation or not? Here we just know how inflation and unemployment will be impacted. But let me give you a quick summary of the paper. So for the model, what they did, this is a big question. They use a big model, and they had a full-scale attack with a global general equilibrium input-output model of average fluctuations via trade and production networks. So this is a giant model. But for such a big questions, you do need a giant model. And what are the key ingredients of this model? So the key ingredients, of course, it's the IO structure. The IO structure works, I think, within countries, but then there are links across countries that are also important. So the international production network is important, and the downward wage rigidities is absolutely critical on how inflation builds up due to the movement of relative prices, movements of the exchange rate. And those are the three big things. And I think this is, so someone can say, oh, this is a big model that it's difficult to follow. No, but this is where the chief contribution of the paper is, because it unravels the key transmission mechanism, and it tells us where we should keep the eyes when this fragmentation happens. And also gives us that nice decomposition of inflation, that you have an extra term in inflation. Maybe we can do a little bit more with that. But it tells us, look, this fragmentation moves prices, domestic prices in the US in certain ways, depending on the structure of the US economy, on the input-output network. But I will come to that in the next slide. So here is what I felt was the key mechanism in the paper. And here, basically, we have downward wage rigidities. We have a supply of labor. You can think that that is the total supply is vertical. And then we have the classic negatively sloped demand. Now, if we have a negative shock, the demand for labor goes down. But it cannot go down to the equilibrium with the supply. It goes to the point B, because we have rigidities, downward nominal rigidity in wages. What happens here, if you are in an open economy, there is an extra point. You go from A to B if you are in the closed economy. In the open economy, the relative wage depends on the exchange rate. So when you have tariffs, for instance, what happens, and this is something that the paper, as I will say, will need to clarify, if you are the originator country and you impose tariff, you have an appreciation of the exchange rate. And here, the exchange rate, they wrote the model such that an appreciation is a fall in epsilon, because it's the number of domestic currencies for unit of foreign currencies, which pushes up the real wage. So you have that, you are going to get unemployment like in the closed economy, but you have an extra kick from the exchange rate that pushes up wages, and firms are going to hire even less, and you have an extra kick on unemployment that increases, and on inflation, on wages that goes up. So that is, I think, is the key mechanism, as I understand it, in the paper. And then here is the key contribution. They show that if you then do a decomposition of inflation, you have that extra term in red. And what I find it curious, and I will point on it, on that little, or I think it's a big matrix WSS, it says, look, the cost of trade, the CN, has an effect on inflation depending on the structure of the network. Notice that the structure of the network does not enter in the other terms. There is a reason for it. We all know it, but I'll come back to that later. Finally, what I find also intriguing that will help me also to discuss the paper is that I think this is the 2018 probably links between the different blocks that they have. Notice, you immediately notice the big arrows. But the trade that the US can do on China, it happens on the little arrows, This is intriguing. But it has a big kick when we are thinking about the results. Because when we look at the results here, we see that if US imposes trade cost on China, US, it has huge inflation. Because here, I think the premise here is that there is an appreciation of the dollar that makes that mechanism that I show you very important. Wages goes up a lot, unemployment falls, and so that's where you have the extra kick. But what is the bottom line of these results? That bilateral tariffs are more costly for the originator country. If you look at this table carefully, you see that the originator, they do the tariff, inflation goes up, self-harming in a way. And including the allies magnifies those effects. So there is a lot of fragmentation, and this spillover are important. And if we do retaliation, they are detrimental, especially for US allies and China. So those are the big takeaway, together with the fact that here I think this is employment. That employment, the story is told about unemployment, but it's the flip side, I guess. Yeah, that China gets the big hit in terms of unemployment. So what are the remarks? The first remarks is that the key mechanism hinges on the fact that there is an exchange rate adjustment when the US imposes tariffs. But here, I think you need to elaborate on that. Is it there? Is it that you have an appreciation of the dollar and a depreciation of all the other currencies involved in this trade war? Because that is absolutely critical on how strong is this impact that you describe in the outset. And also, when they impose tariffs, those arrows are very small. The trade between China and the US is small. Those arrows are the smallest, yet they have the biggest impact. Is it the IO network structure? And I think here the elephant in the room, at least in the descriptions that I got, is that there is not much granularity in the description of the use of the IO structure. Second comment is in the network, that how do you do this trade cost? Do you do it like across all goods or a subset of goods? Because for this mechanism to work, it needs to have a huge readjustment of the exchange rate. And there I think you need to be clear. And can you actually use the model to tell me through the input-output structure that if you give tariffs to certain sectors, it's actually strategic in order to avoid inflation? And here I think the network plays a role, because otherwise it's difficult to explain these numbers. Here, the network play a role in your decomposition. In the other part, it does not play a role because products market are perfectly are perfect. If you don't do that, the structure of the US economy would also play a role on how these terms are assigned. On top of it, when you show me this stuff, it would be nice if you can tell me what is the fractions now that you have this trade cost. Is it a big fraction? Do they explain a big fraction of inflation? I have 1 minute, I'll do the miracle. I finish on time. And then I have one small question on whether I think here it will be critical to show that the model is empirically grounded, especially looking at the dynamics of the exchange rate in the US, exchange rate appreciation, increase in real wage, and inflation at the same time. And I think you can leverage this as a motivation of the paper. And finally, I go to the monetary policy. Monetary policy, I very much like the idea when I start reading the slides that was about monetary policy, but in the end, it boils down to the dynamics of inflation and unemployment. What I really want to know, if I'm the guy in the top chair at the Fed, is, okay, I see this trade cost shock. Should I change my behavior? Is it similar to a cost push shock? Should I accommodate it more or less than other shocks? And I think that will be the next step. Let me then conclude, says that this is an ambitious research agenda. It charts the uncharted in connecting trade cost with macroeconomic performance. I felt that probably if we had a bit more focus on empirical validation of the key mechanism, that will really push the paper to the next level, but also to exploit the granularity in the IO structure that you do have, but you don't take advantage of. And I think if you could do the extra step with monetary policy, that will make a big difference to policymakers. And with that, hopefully on time, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very close to being on time. And we would collect questions now from the audience. Maybe collect like 3, or do you want to respond first and then collect questions? Okay. Yes.
Danny Gross from Bocconi. There's a general theorem in trade that if 2 countries erect trade barriers against each other, then the rest of the world should gain. I did not see that in your results, or just did not see it. If it is reflected in your results, if you could just point it out, please.
Okay, second question here, yes.
Jan Schmitz from the European Commission. Apologies in case I missed it, but what is the reason for the Chinese unemployment rising so dramatically? I mean, can the model tell you something about the reasons for this, the mechanisms?
And yes, here. Next. Can you take this one?
Hi, Shekhar Iyer, IMF. Şebnem, so this is already like a tremendous advancement to the literature. But what I'm going to ask is, I mean, it's not in your model, but maybe you can speculate. What happens if it's not a tariff barrier, but some sort of quantitative restriction? You know, you have the US basically banning advanced technology to Huawei. Under the IRA, you're eligible for subsidies, provided that the investment didn't come from, you know, countries of concern, like China is one of them. The others are Iran, Russia, and North Korea, I think. So, because what I'm not clear about is whether you get the appreciation effects, which are crucial, as the discussant pointed out, if you have quantitative restrictions as opposed to tariffs.
Would you like to answer these three questions first? Or?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So let me start with that. So we have that effect. If you remember that figure I showed you, the bottom line was rest of the world. So India, Argentina, Indonesia, all those countries are there, and they actually have like almost negligible inflation and not a big change in unemployment at all. So like it's almost zero. So in that sense, actually, it begs the question that when those countries are now thinking who to join, they should think twice. Right now, when the full-blown trade war happens, they're out. It's US allies, China allies. They are completely out, and they are definitely the least affected in terms of inflation. Basically, they are not, you know, getting anything. So that is there. Now, the China unemployment. So it is the story is two-pronged, right? So first is this whole not being able to get this input. The input is expensive, right? So the trade cost is more expensive input. So that's going to definitely, you know, slow down production, lower demand for factors. You know, one of the factors is labor. You know, we are going to be unemployed and all that. So, but this can also happen in a closed economy. This is what Francesco is saying. In an open economy, you have all this. On top of that, you also have this higher real wage appreciation, you know, all that becoming poorer effect. So the two effects combine, right? So the closed economy effect, where you don't need this exchange rate story, and then on top of that, open economy. That's why you have an unemployment and then more unemployment, right? Why China more than the US is because they are getting way more intermediate inputs than the rest of the world. And when I block the China and China allies, they are actually a very small part of the world now, right? I mean, US and US allies is a big part. Rest of the world is a very big part outside this. So that's what is happening. Now, Shaker question, I mean, that's where, I mean, of course, I cannot say if it is another restriction, like a quantity restriction, technology ban, you know, if same is going to happen or not, I don't know. I mean, I cannot tell. That requires even more detail, that type of a trade cost. So here, you should think this as anything that will increase the input price, right? And in fact, this is, you know, what Janet Yellen saying today, and Biden gave a speech a couple months ago. So input is more expensive, right? I mean, some of these are going to be domestic, some of them foreign, but it's just more expensive. So that's how it's working. I mean, you know, so there might be other effects going through if we think of different things. Or maybe you can think normatively, and maybe those types will be better. You know, we don't know, but I mean, you have to put these things in and then analyze. Can I go back to Discussant? Or okay? So thank you so much. I mean, these are great comments. I mean, it's always you know, the dream of the author when the paper is charting the uncharted. We are very happy to be charting the uncharted. So. I mean, all well taken. In fact, I believe R3, R4, R5, we are working on exactly those things. Network structures very important, it matters. You're exactly right. So we will definitely work on those things. And in fact, you gave us a very good idea. Then use the structure now to tell me, well, maybe there's this strategic way of thinking thinking the tariffs, right? So yeah, all well taken. One thing here, again, the monetary policy question, again, this is not a normative paper, right? We are not talking about optimal monetary policy here, but in this class of models, actually, the optimal version of these models, normative version, there is this result that they are all closed economy models. There is this result that monetary policy should either target the relative price or shouldn't do anything, right? So there is that result. Not here, obviously, and I don't know what that result will be in an open economy, but that is definitely a lot of food for thought to think about. Now, in the exchange rate comments, yes, I mean, the model is going to give you the originating country is going to have an appreciating exchange rate, right? And that's consistent with the data, the paper you cite, and US originates, US dollar is going to appreciate vis-a-vis the rest of the world, right? So that's consistent with the data. Now, of course, in generally, if you tell me, okay, it is consistent with the data, and remember, also monetary policy tightens too, right? That's also going to add to appreciation. But if you tell me match the exchange rate, exactly as is, of course, we are not going to be able to do that because, again, the only wedge here is the trade wedge, right? I mean, as we know very well, in fact, Oleg might be talking about this in the next room, you need another wedge. You need a wedge in the UIP condition to be able to match it fully, right? But the direction is consistent. An interesting thing here is also like how, that type of a very, macro story is being combined with this micro network structure. And final point, we should look at that, what you called puzzling again, and I believe definitely network structure has a role here, but I wouldn't think it's that puzzling. And the numbers are not that far off. I just made a quick calculation. So the China share in America is around 1.3%. You log off that 0.5, multiply by 50, that is going to be around 0.5 inflation. It's not that off, actually. I mean, it does look at the first thing, because I mean, these are the two countries in the news. The entire world is being wrecked because of these two countries. And yes, I mean, they are kind of this the lowest share. So that's why it's ironic. But the numbers are not that off. I mean, but I'm sure, there is definitely part of the story why, because China numbers are higher, right? Coming from the network structure that we should investigate further. Any other question? I guess no. Or
I guess no. I think we move on to the next session. But I suppose that you would be available for more questions in the next coffee break.
Yes, I'm available. Please come with your questions and comments and everything. We want to hear all. This is very preliminary. We really appreciate all the feedback, and thank you again, Francesco. Thank you so much.
Thank both of you for being here. And with that, we move from the Price of Fragmentation to the Fragmentation Paradox, presented by Thierry. Welcome. We are also very happy to have you here, of course. Not as long as away as our previous speaker. Nonetheless, yes, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. You have 20 minutes.
You tell me when I'm over time, huh?
Yes, I will be the annoying one with the cards here. Very good. If you'd like to be standing, you just need to be sure that you're standing close-ish to the microphone. Thank you.
That's fine. I can definitely do that. Thank you very much for having me again to that great conference. So this paper, joint with Isabelle, Mejean, and Mathias Thoenig, is sort of combining elements of what some of you have seen this morning, Massimo's paper, and the paper we just seen right now, Şebnem. And it's going to talk about the fragmentation paradox. Is what are the economic costs of de-risking, de-risking trade, that reducing trade between US and China, for instance, but taking into account the endogenous probability of actually going at war, of actually triggering the conflict, and how those two things interact. So it's a paper about fragmentation of global trade. And it's high on the policy agenda. I don't have to explain that here. But the third bullet point is the most important, is that most of the literature, as long as we know it, has been looking at trade policy. De-risking is trade policy in an insecure world, right? You want to de-risk, so there must be some risk. But it takes the risk as given. It doesn't, most of the literature doesn't take the endogenous probability of a conflict arising as something endogenous, as something that actually is going to be moved by trade. Yet, actually, if you want a narrative about how trade might have precipitated or the fall of trade might have precipitated some wars. You can take the historical collapse of global trade. As Massimo was saying, this thing is actually ambiguous in the theory. We're going to get back to that. And we're going to take the two-way causation between trade and geopolitics, and in that model, in a sort of an extension of a model we had with Philippe Martin and Mathias Thoenig, and apply it and show that de-risking can actually, paradoxically, make the world less safe. Maybe paradoxically, it can actually make the world less safe. It will tend to do so. And that's going to undo some of the welfare gains to be expected of de-risking. If you de-risk, it's because you expect something good out of it, is that if you go at war, you're going to be less dependent on the country you go at war with, and that's increasing your welfare, that's reducing your geoeconomic losses. But if at the same time you're increasing the risk of that bad thing happening, there's something of a balance here, and we're going to study here the extent of the balance try to quantify that. This is going to be a very simplistic model of conflicts. Massimo has presented some of the elements already, so I'm going to be a little bit short. The difference here is that it's going to be a model where it's a diplomatic game of concessions between two countries that have to agree on how to share a pie, and if they don't agree, they go at war. I'm going to have no aggressor here in the other country. They have to agree. If they don't agree, they go at war. There's going to be something. So why should they do that ever if they're rational? And we believe that there's gigantic cost of wars. Gernot has shown us with a paper with Moritz that those huge effects of war, so they should be rational and never go at war. Well, the question is about, the whole thing is about imperfect information or incomplete information and asymmetries of information. Is that you don't know actually my cost and I don't know your cost. And that's what's going to make it possible to actually go at war here, is that when this uncertainty is large enough and the losses, the opportunity cost of war are small enough, there's going to be some actually situations where you actually go at war. The opportunity cost of war, the thing that you see in red here, the OCW, are going to be foregone real consumption. And we're going to use something that is now pretty classical in structural trade, in like sort of quantitative trade model. We're going to take an elaborated model with input-output linkage that was just presented to you. It's going to be actually a little bit simpler in some dimensions and a little bit more complicated in others. And that's going to give me something about the opportunity cost of war, which is the economic, the pure thing that the consumer should care about, which means that a democracy or even an autocracy should care about, maybe with different weights, but they should care about that if they want to be reelected or if they don't want to be thrown out of power, okay? And now we're going to put that into a model of war. I'm going to quantify three things that are new, in a sense that arise because of the possibility of a war. I'm going to call them the endogenous geoeconomic factors. And they all depend on those OCW. It's going to be the probability of escalation to war, of course. It's going to be the ex-post true cost of a war, which means destruction, plus trade, everything that is going to be lowering my real consumption if the war happens. And something that I think is new in the debates, you don't hear very often, is that if you are to negotiate to avoid a war, you got to make some concessions. Essentially, you want to avoid wars. And if you want to avoid wars, you come to the table and you make concessions to try to avoid wars. In the model, there's a very clear prediction, which is that those concessions are going to be based on the asymmetry of the opportunity cost of wars. If you got a lot to lose, you're going to have to pay me not to go at war because you got a lot to lose compared to me, and the difference in the opportunity cost of war is going to be here. With the functional form assumption that we're going to make here, it's going to be a very trivial thing, and that's going to be one of the cost of the possibility of wars is how much I've got to pay you to avoid that. Okay, so here we're gonna typically show you one case, which is one application, which is USA-China. We've but it's of course applicable to many, many things. If this whole thing relies on the fact that you think that trade is harmed by wars. If trade is not harmed by wars, of course, there's nothing to de-risk about and forget about it. So here you can see two, one that is almost pure data on the left. This is India, Pakistan, and you see this line, this red line in one is the gravity prediction. A very simple gravity prediction over time. Okay, so essentially, if the world, if India and Pakistan would be at normal trade, they would be on this red line. Okay, and you can see that in 1948, they are 20 times above the normal. Well, yes, they just got out of being actually the same country under the common colonizer. So they trade way too much, but you see that each of those red points is a war with intensity 5, which is the maximum, more than 1,000 people. Military killed on the battlefield. And you see that it goes down and down and down. In 1965, there's a big war that goes, this thing goes now to 5% of what it should be. And it still goes down, it sort of never recovers. That's one of the pair that, that actually goes at war the most often. That's one example. On the right, I gave you the Glick and Taylor estimation of world wars. And you can see that on impact, the bilateral trade goes down by 85% between two countries that go at war. And the minus 12% that you see at the second gray bar is actually what is costly in terms of trade, not with the country you're at war with, but with the rest of the world. So it's like a war is essentially killing trade, 85% of it between the two countries. And it's also destroying ports, or there are sanctions, or there are lots of stuff that reduce trade by 12%. And it goes essentially back to normal after 10 years. 10 years of peace, you go back to what gravity predicts, which is what gravity works well, and so it enables us to use that. We're going to do something like that in a more elaborate model, where you have a lot of input-output linkages, etc., but it's essentially going to be the same picture. We're going to impose, you see this 85 and 12%, we're going to impose in our counterfactuals that this is the cost of a war. If you go at war between China and USA, it's going to go down by 85%, 12% with the rest of the world, and we compute the opportunity cost of war about that. So very fast, telling you about the sequence of events. So first, the two countries have to have a dispute. Okay, so they got a dispute about some resource that is divisible. Okay, so they got a pie to share. They got to agree on how to share it, essentially. It can be on your soil, on my soil, in the middle, whatever. It's got to be something that we agree how to share. And they got to agree on a diplomatic protocol, and that's where mechanism design theorists help us a lot. They negotiate under the chosen protocol, and if they agree, there's a transfer, positive or negative between N and M. Otherwise, they go at war, as I was already saying. If they do go at war, there's three types of costs that we can allow in this model. First, there's, of course, human losses. So those are consumers, workers, so it's, of course, affecting welfare. There's economic damages. This is called alpha. So there's the TFP drop. Everything is going to be less efficient. And there's those tau bill and tau mule that I just showed you before, which is how much trade cost at valorem equivalent is increased by a bilateral war, and how much trade with the rest of the world is actually, trade cost is actually increased. Okay, so that's what war is going to be about in our model. The utility cost of war is going to be this first term, the difference in the log of the real consumption between peace and war, OCW, and I'm going to show you OCW a lot after that. And it's going to be this U tilde, which is the private information of how much my resource is actually destroyed, how much of my resource can I keep if I go to war, and that's private. Okay, this U tilde is private. How much you can view that as, okay, what is my probability of having a lot of damage and not you a lot of damage? What is my military superiority compared to you, because that's going to affect, of course, the shrinkage between this resource, the sharing. But that has to be separated from consumption. So that's one thing here. You see it's additively separable from consumption in order to resolve the model. Another thing is that we make, the model makes the assumption, the game theory part of it, that peace is Pareto dominating war. Is that actually this sum of the utildes has to be negative, and they can be negatively correlated, and they're going to be uniformly distributed here. Okay. So they're free to choose any type of protocol. It's a very general thing. So let me show you immediately the results by Kintzinger. So there's two types of things. First, they got to agree on a protocol. And so here we just borrow from Kintzinger, and they say, okay, the simple mechanism here achieves the second best. They first announce some utility cost of war that is going to be different from their true utility cost of war. Then they, if it's compatible, if they don't overshoot jointly, they agree on a transfer, and then they produce and consume, etc. Okay? If they don't agree on transfer, then they go at war. Okay? And the optimal announcement that you see at the bottom, once you've agreed on that, you see the announcement is 2/3 of the true cost. So they have a tendency to strategically misreport, which is that have overclaim on the pie compared to what they really should, which means that, and to show you in a nutshell, which means that if there is actually not too much of a cost of war and a lot of uncertainty, those two guys having a tendency to overclaim will tend this thing to, in some cases, go actually at war, and that's this red part compared to the blue triangle in this magnificent drawing by Mathias Thoenig, the theorist of the group. Not quantitative theorist, but graphing theorist. And so the economics of those things are the following. So there's essentially 3 equations plus a last one that joins them that is sufficient. The probability of the appeasement is going to be a function of the squared, but the important is that it's a sum of the opportunity cost of war. Okay? The more there is to lose jointly, the more we will tend to agree in equilibrium. But the peacekeeping cost, the transfer, is going to be a difference between those two opportunity cost of war. Okay? So there's going to be this tension between the levels and the difference, and of course, the actual opportunity cost of war we can compute. The true cost of war is this opportunity cost of war conditional on war happening, which means that if I go back to that super drawing, you see you don't go at war over the whole triangle. You avoid the worst wars in equilibrium. And so this is just conditional, my opportunity cost of war. And let me now summarize what is the welfare on which I'm going to compute. The expected welfare in the shadow of war, so ex ante, before knowing whether war will happen or not, is that blue thing, which is my essentially real consumption in terms of peace. And the red thing is the Geoeconomics loss. And you see that it's a weighted average of the cost of how much I've got to pay you to avoid war, and that's multiplied by S if we stay at peace, and 1 minus S, which is the true cost of war if we go at war. So that's this thing which is essentially the Geoeconomics loss, and I can compute it. So now let me take the 5 last minute to actually show you the empirical illustration. I'm not going to show you how we calculate the OCW, but it's a very similar model to what Szebnem just showed. So you believe it, and it's beautiful, and it works. And I just show you some graphs instead. So this is actually the TIVA. So that's this new fantastic input-output matrix for the whole world of 60 countries, I think. This is the one that goes from 95 to 2020. The bilateral consumption, the first left graph, is how much USA consumes from China as a percent of its overall consumption. And by the way, all those data sets have services in there, which means that everything related to trade is going to be dampened like crazy. right? Think about, because all these services is mostly non-tradable, so all those mechanisms are based on trade, so you got to keep that in mind. Okay, so that's why it's only 1.4% of consumption here. But you see, the USA goes up, China doesn't depend very much it doesn't depend more than before, and those two things cross, which is going to bring me to my next slide. So on the left, you see the opportunity cost of war for USA and China. So in blue, we got the USA, and in red, we got China over time. This is the ones that we compute. So it's what would be the opportunity cost of war, so the loss in real consumption, if there was a full-blown war with 85% less trade, 12% less trade with the rest of the world, 3% of loss of TFP between USA and China. And you can see that those things cross again, which is that at the first, the USA actually loses less and China loses more. And at the end, because of that trade evolution, it's the USA that would lose more in economic terms. Okay? And you can see also the dotted line, for those of you who see the dotted line in gray here, is the probability of peace. So it goes up and down again, as you can see that the opportunity cost, the sum of those things goes up and down, you got some evolution of that S. On the middle, I think it's the most important, you got those geoeconomic costs. Let me remind you what they are. Those geoeconomic costs are those red terms, okay? So the TCW is the red graph, the PKC is the black graph, here in the middle, and the yellow is the weighted average. So it means that essentially after 2010, USA has to pay China in terms of diplomatic concessions in order to avoid war. And it was the reverse before, just because of their bilateral asymmetry in the dependency. Now it has to be that the USA has to accommodate China on many things because of this bilateral dependency, okay? And that's growing over time. Now put yourself at the very end, and let's think about de-risking. So the final thing about the title of the paper, I'm going to do a post-2018 de-risking. So I'm taking this situation in 2018, this is the world, and now I'm going to de-risk, which means that USA is going to increase its trade cost. If you look only on the right of this graph, you're going to increase this trade cost with respect to China by 5, 10, 15, 20, 25%. Okay, so each of those dots is the USA imposing trade cost of 10% or 20% to China. As you see, and then you can calculate the opportunity cost of war, which means that now if I impose 20% tariff on China, I trade less with China, which means that if I go at war with China, it's less costly. That's the whole spirit of de-risking, I think. But that's only looking at the red, there's no laser on this? No? Yes, maybe. On the right graph, you can see the red, which is the true cost of war if a war happens, okay? And the thing is that, of course, this thing goes down if the war happens, but S goes up. 1 minus S goes up, so the war becomes more likely. So there's a cost here, and I'm going to finish here, which is that as you de-risk, you reduce the cost the cost of paying China, the cost of going at war with China, if you go at war with China, but you make that event more likely, which means that the welfare thing is unsigned. But here we can say what it is. We can say that there's actually, look at the right figure here. This is a total welfare of de-risking. So the black line is the pure economic cost. The yellow is what you gain in terms of the geoeconomic losses. So that's a gain. And so the red is the addition of the two. And you can see that, yes, when you de-risk with China, you actually will have a little bit less losses than because of the reduction of wars, but the global balance is still a very strong negative picture. It didn't have to be so. The red could have been above 0, could be U-shaped if you go far enough, but in our quantification, the red is still pretty close to the black, which means that the geoeconomic losses are not enough to actually reverse the story. And I'll finish here. Sorry for being a little bit over there. The floor to my discussant. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. I learned a huge deal and about 2 different literatures while reading this paper and listening to Thierry today. I have to say it's a huge paper, so it's really hard to fit it into 20 minutes to make a full sense of it. So I'll try to overview it first and then give some comments. So we've seen, first because of the first presentation in this session, and in general just following the news, that geopolitical tensions often push deglobalization through sanctions, through trade wars, through de-risking. But the question is could there be additional negative feedback loop from de-risking to more geopolitical tensions? And that negative feedback loop is exactly what this paper is trying to theorize about and calculate the probability of. So the paper basically asks, can de-risking make countries more likely to go to war? So this paper overall adds a lot of more nuance to theories of why we fight, why conflicts happen, and it explains it through a very nice structure where why we fight could be driven by de-risking. So the huge paper consists of 3 parts, where the first part is a bargaining model, where 2 countries choose this optimal protocol, which allows actually for the authors to calculate the equilibrium of this model, and then allows to sort of calculate 3 important components: the probability that 2 countries will start fighting, the costs for the 2 countries in the time of peace, and the cost for the 2 countries in the time of war. So if you think about welfare of countries, when there's no conflict, we just calculate welfare as consumption value, so welfare during peace, and we don't think about any geopolitical interactions. But in this model, you kind of add an additional component of welfare, which is ln in red, that changes the usual calculation of the country when it decides on trade policy or other policies, and will depend on, crucially, on the probability that the war might happen, and will depend on its bargaining power with the other country. So that is the ln adding to normal utility function. So this component, ln, then leads us to the next big chunk of the paper, because ln, as the authors show, will depend on opportunity cost of war. It's quite elegant. It's just one parameter will determine all pieces of geopolitical factors, all pieces that countries will take into consideration before going to war. And the contribution of this paper, in addition to showing this elegant bargaining model, is to calculate this opportunity cost of war with a large trade model. So this model will contain many elements that countries will take into consideration when they go to war. So the first element, and there's no pointer, but the first element is, in this large equation, is economic damages, because when you go to war, you stop producing at the same capacity, and there you can model it as a reduction in productivity costs. Another very important cost of war is losses of factors, so losses of human life and capital, and that's the component on the second line, the first component on the second line, and you can also plug it into the calculation of opportunity cost of war. And finally, the probably key component for this version of the paper is the trade frictions. So this trade frictions, you lose trade when you start fighting with your combatant. And basically how much the loss of trade will punish you in the case of you fighting will determine your opportunity cost of war. So how much your combatant has you on the hook basically will determine this opportunity cost of war, and then in turn will determine the probability of war and determine your outcomes during peacetime and wartime. So with this in mind, let me just kind of summarize the main kind of message of the paper. So countries, there's a tension between de-risking and going to de-risking because of this opportunity cost of war affecting probability of war. When countries de-risk, it seems very rational and very optimal if they feel like there's a conflict between those two countries. It's rational because it reduces your peacetime transfer, it reduces your cost of maintaining peace. It reduces your cost of actual war because you do risk. You don't have to. You lose less when you stop trading with your opponent. But it has the opposite effect on the probability cost of war or probability of war, because if a war becomes less costly, it increases the likelihood that you will not find an agreement, and increases the importance of asymmetric information in this bargaining game. Okay, so this not internalizing the probability of escalation when countries de-risk is basically the key takeaway. So I would say it raised many thoughts when I was reading this paper, and I think it's an amazing paper. It provides a lot of intuition and structure in how we think about conflict. For example, so with this model in mind, did the EU do the right thing by not de-risking from Russia in 2014? So the war happened in 2022, but would de-risking increase already the likelihood of that war happening, or make that war even happen even sooner? That's the question. Or in the hindsight, if the probability of that war happening was so certain, then it would be optimal for EU to de-risk already in advance and stop appeasing. So again, this model can calculate sort of the optimality of de-risking in this scenario and many other scenarios. Okay, so I will quickly go over my 3 comments. I think you could consider them more like suggestions when you write the paper, just giving you a little bit more context to the reader who is an amateur in this field. So, opportunity cost of war crucially depends on the level of de-risking. It crucially depends on how much the other opponent has you on the hook based on the trade, bilateral trade with that opponent. But the question is how much this factor is important when you consider other factors in the opportunity cost of war calculation. For example, loss of life and capital. They are important from the economic point of view, and the paper considers that, but they could be directly entering the utility function of the representative agent. And so kind of comparing the costs of war in the sense that you lose factors of production through the economic channel. Yes, okay, there is a cost, but there could be even bigger cost if you just want to avoid loss of life and loss of your buildings in your country. So I wonder how the paper can kind of speak to additional kind of non-monetary costs, non-economic costs. And second one, and I think you mentioned it a little bit, is when you have countries bargaining, it's usually done by the leaders of these countries. And if you think about a democratic country and an autocratic country, the leader in the autocratic country will not internalize all the economic gains and losses in the case of war. And so if you put the weight of 0 to the economic gains and losses and the weight of 100 to, for example, personal risks that an autocratic leader will face, then basically the importance of trade and the importance of de-risking becomes quite small, at least for that autocratic leader. So I was wondering if it was possible to kind of calculate some scenarios where you have asymmetry between an autocrat and democrat, and see how much de-risking would matter there. Additionally, so the paper builds up on a really nice and famous paper by Philippe Martin and the same authors, Thierry and Mathias, in 2008, that uses a simpler trade model to calculate opportunity costs of war without any input-output linkages. And then, at least in the draft that I read, I mean, it's the new paper talks a little bit about input-output linkages, but I wanted a little bit more intuition how that would change welfare calculations, how would that change probability of war. I mean, you say that, yes, the fact that world is now more integrated in terms of especially the value chains, yes, the opportunity cost of war is higher, and so the war is less likely. But, you know, we talked about the asymmetric cost to China because of asymmetric cost to China because it depends on global value chains more. So how, if you do your welfare calculations with final goods trade and with IO trade and compare the two, that would be really nice. And a very last comment, very quickly. So the paper, not the presentation, used one more example on calculating the probability of war, and that was the case between Russia and Ukraine. And here, I mean, first, the conflict started not in 22, but in 2014. And it looks like, even in the data that the paper shows, the trade actually was increasing before 2014, so between 2010 and 2014. And so, but the conflict still happened. So here, I mean, kind of, could you speak a little bit about like why, why this didn't play out the same way as the model would predict? And second, I think to describe the conflict in 2022, after a long period of de-risking between Russia and Ukraine, it's important to consider also decoupling between Russia and the collective West. Because Russia would probably take into consideration the loss of trade with EU much more deciding to go to war than just loss of trade with Ukraine. And so I think that would kind of be very, very interesting to think about that. And finally, I mean, is loss of trade with Russia, was that an important component for Ukraine to stop accepting whatever was suggested to it in the bargaining table by Russia? Or there were other factors that are unrelated to trade? It would be really helpful to the reader. But overall, it's an amazing paper. One can learn a lot reading it, and I suggest everyone to read it and think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to react to the discussion? I mean, you can also stay there, wherever you want to sit. I just was told that the next point on the agenda was moved to 3:45 instead of 3:30, so we have a lot of time to answer questions now, and there's no rush for the coffee. There will be plenty of time. Yep. Do you want to answer first and then collect questions?
No, of course.
Okay.
So yes, there might be something about, for the first question, about the weight of loss of life directly into utility. That we could definitely do that. I think it's related to that question about democracies versus autocracies and sort of the weights. Right now, it's not in the model per se, but there's two questions. Is whether you want asymmetry in the sort of the alphas and the gammas, even though they enter the opportunity cost of war right now and not directly the utility still. You might view that as an implicit cost. You could have alpha times the perception of how much it matters. I mean, or you can have it directly. I think we could have that without too much of a problem. One thing that will really, I think, be more difficult is that an autocracy is more uncertain. So it's like probably you got a more uncertainty and more asymmetry between autocracy, democracy than two democracies in terms of the thing. Or maybe not, but it could be that it's much harder to predict, and somehow the autocrats want it that way. It's harder to predict what would be the cost, and so that would be changing the ETA. With respect to the 2008 paper calculation of opportunity cost of war, so first, this original paper was only computing the probability of escalation. It was not doing the welfare. Second, of the opportunity cost of war, the IO, the input-output thing is going to be really important, because if your partner is hurt in terms of alpha, in terms of its TFP, it's going to feed back in a very magnified way, because his TFP is going to hurt you because you use this as inputs it's much bigger extent than the direct. So there can be some magnification effect in that effect. Also, in the old paper, we were doing general equilibrium. We were doing this thing without nominal wage adjustment and without production adjustment. So that also actually changes things quite a lot, because those are massive effects in terms of GDPs, in terms of TFP and trade. So having general equilibrium is much more. It was a challenge at the time, but it's not anymore. So that's good. That's the good news about the technology. Russia, Ukraine, yeah, we need to do that seriously. That graph. I mean, the one thing for sure is that the Russia-Ukraine trade was actually, the bilateral was decreasing, but Russia was trading more with the rest of the world, which acts as an insurance, as we explained in that very first paper. Mm-hmm. So that makes the conflict more likely. That makes escalation more likely.
Right. But the rest of the world includes EU in a way. So in the EU's side of Ukraine. So.
But if you think about the estimates of the third-party trade sanctions, in a sense, those are relatively minor compared to the bilateral. So here we took the most extreme, which is 12%, but in our original paper, it was not even 5%. So your global trade with the rest of the world, when you fight one country, goes down very little with the rest of the world. So that's... sorry.
Okay, thank you. Should we open the floor now to questions from the audience? And we would collect questions if that's okay for you. Okay, let's start with the ones who haven't asked questions yet. So, yeah.
Hello, thank you. My name is Jonathan Pakroff. I'm a journalist at Euractiv. I realize this is not a very academic question, but we are at the ministry here, so I want to ask it. Would you say that de-risking, like the EU is currently doing vis-à-vis China, for instance, is a mistake? Would you conclude that?
Jesse Schrager, Columbia. This is a really interesting paper. And one thing I'd be curious to hear is, in the context of the framework, what would the characteristics of a good be where, say, the US or China were to buy, for a given amount of dollars, they would increase trade together? What would be the characteristics of a good that would have the most effect on, say, raising the opportunity cost of war?
Thank you. And then, yes, I saw a hand over there.
Peter Eppinger from Tübingen. Thanks a lot. This is really obviously very important and exciting work, bringing also endogenizing this choice. My question is rather specific about this opportunity cost of war and how you empirically discipline that. I understand you use gravity in a sense, but it's always seemed to be a country-specific variable, although we would probably expect that it's kind of bilateral, right? So, and since you picked that example of China, US, here the opportunity cost of war, of a full-blown war would kind of be infinite, right? So annihilation. So how do you do that? And then I think quite something probably depends on that number, right?
Yeah. And please apologize to the left side of this room. I can't really see everyone, but maybe there's also a female participant having a question. No, okay, then we start with the three first questions.
So the question is de-risking a mistake. It really depends on the precise case. So for instance, here I showed what Alvaro is saying for USA China. It might be quite different actually for Europe China, because the relationships are not asymmetric as exactly the same. They're not maybe on the same goods, and so the picture might be very different. We didn't do it yet. So I should say, this is the very first thing we do with the full quantitative apparatus. The thing that you saw with Russia-Ukraine was a very, very sort of a reduced form of that. So we're going to obviously test other and say a mistake here. I mean, defining a mistake is that you got to believe a lot the model, right? Is that this probability of going at war is what's going to drive whether it's a mistake or not. Because if it's increasing the probability of war too much, yeah, for sure it's going to be a mistake. So how this probability of war adjusts is really key. So take it with a grain of salt. But here for USA-China, for sure, the economic costs are way dominating the geoeconomic gains. That's what this thing is telling us. On the so yes, we can that's next on the to-do list, which is look for what would be de-risking goods that would have the, so here Baki and Fari type of theoretical findings of which are the goods that are the most critical in the sense that those Domar weights about the global influence really are going to be, essentially it's going to be the good, it's going to be a weighted average of the goods where you have super high dependence and very low substitutability. Okay, so those are the things that will essentially be the critical thing. But, and to respond to the asked question, fed into this global general equilibrium computation, which renders everything pretty complicated. So how is this opportunity cost of war computed? So very practically, we take the matrix of trade flows, the matrix of GDPs, and the model is forget about the input-output linkages for a minute. The model is telling us that a change in trade costs and a change in productivity, you got a new matrix of trade flows, a new vector of GDP, and that's the new state of the world. Okay, so that's what we do in trade with those quantitative trade models. Now, how to do that for a war? Well, we put those numbers, which are, of course, rough estimates, for the precise US-China pair, taken in 2018. And we recompute, so for instance, it's a little bit like what you were having, the US-China asymmetric tariff. So USA is cutting, there's no retaliation, but it still has an effect. So it makes USA nominal wage increase because you export more, including to yourself, so that your nominal wage increase, the nominal wage of China in the first round decreases, but that makes China a better competitor everywhere because its wage decrease. So it's increasing its market share everywhere in the world, so it's affecting everybody. So the wage of everybody is moving and the trade flows are moving, and when it stops moving, you're done and you get your opportunity cost of war. And we extract the welfare cost for all the countries in the world, actually. And I just showed you one here. Sorry, a long answer.
I've seen at least 2 more questions on this side. Yes?
Yeah, this is Hamid Firuz from University of Rochester. A very nice paper. So I was wondering, should we really interpret the war as a military war, or can we relabel everything as a trade war? Meaning that if some trade war begins, would that continue more trade war? Because I'm asking this because in that trade war you wouldn't expect maybe necessarily productivity losses or
yes.
trade cost
yes.
increasing with third-party countries. This is why I'm asking, can we relabel everything or not?
Yeah, I'll be a little bit provocative.
Mm-hmm.
So I follow you on the outcomes of the model, given the utility structure you use, right? So leaders care for the destruction of people and capital, for trade and output. But unfortunately, leaders don't always care for this, right? So it's a little bit the points you also made as discussant. And I mean, we know that the single best indicator, historically, for countries not going to war is they're both democracies, right? Because if they are democracies, the utility factors which you cite play a role for their decision-making.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't, or at least not to the extent they do in democracies, then the likelihood of war is much higher. So I guess you accept that not being covered in the model. But I think it would potentially, I know it's very, very difficult, but it would be interesting to enlarge the utility factors which affect these decisions in order to capture these. Because unfortunately, the problem which we face as I would say the global West, yeah, with Russia and China, is that we are not sure the other side is really following the assumption of utility which you cite, right? And therefore, the payoffs for de-risking are also different to what you predict in your model, right? They might be much higher because the risk of that war being started from the other side is much higher.
Okay, yes.
Verge of, thank you, on the verge of going to war, and then think about the economic determinants of that. But a simple theory, you kind of would like to explain the world to you, right? And I'm grappling with whether the model can explain peace, because most countries do not go to war with each other, right? And if I understand correctly, the probability of war is determined by the difference in the opportunity cost of war. So if I think of a big country like the US or China, and then vis-a-vis almost any small country, wouldn't the model predict that they go to war? Because for the bigger country, the opportunity cost is much lower, or did I not understand correctly here?
Do you want to take on more questions or move other questions to the coffee break?
You're the boss.
We have, okay. I will say let's move other questions to the coffee break. Okay, then you have some time to respond.
That's fine. I can respond to those ones at least.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so is war a military war or a trade war? I think in order, so yes, you can interpret that as a trade war, I think. With the caveat that it's going to be, I mean, you would need to have a trade model where the TFP, which is here like a complete residual, I mean, there is, in the fact that there's input-output linkages is going to make this, the country less productive because the costs of the inputs is growing, but not the TFP, which is really, okay, you destroy capital and etc. So I think you would need to cut this channel for this to be a trade war, and of course the loss of workers. But yes, you can have this thing as a more general conflict than the pure military. But the fact that the de-risking is so linked to the geopolitical risk, I think makes it the obvious application. But you can say the dispute about China and the USA is about not agreeing on what is the good level of trade. And there you can say, okay, I'm going to put 200% of everything you do, and that's the threat. So the fact that the leaders in democracies and autocracies have different weights, I think in the model, the way it can be handled right now is this utility, which is the uncertain cost of a war. Okay, so there's the pure economy, and then there's this additive thing, which is there's a resource, and there's this uncertain amount of the resource that you're going to lose. And you can view this resource, and it's a utility of the decision maker, right? So you can view this thing as having this uncertain part as having a gigantic share, And you can even make it like for autocratic leader, it might actually, this utility might be negative. It looks good to be a chief of war and to look strong, etc. So that I don't think there's fundamentally an impossibility to treat that within that setup. We would need to empirically think about how to maybe estimate this type of uncertainty and this type of non-economic gains and losses in autocracy and democracy, because yes, there's this democratic peace hypothesis is like there's never been, it's a little bit more restrictive than that. Huh? There's never been a war of intensity 5, the one I've showed you, between two full democracies. So it's the political scientists have found this thing. There's never been a war of full intensity between two full democracies. There's been a lot of wars between democracies, a lot of bad things happening between democracies. And the last question, can you explain a dispute between asymmetric countries? Yes, I think here, again, the US, there's this part that is uncertain in this thing. The economic losses would be very unequal, which means that, in a sense, a small country has to give way to the USA diplomatically, right? But we see that. The small countries that depend a lot on the USA have to, because they got bilateral asymmetric thing, they obey to the USA when they ask to. I mean, and same thing for France. I mean, I'm not targeting the USA. So I think we see that.
Okay. So now I think we need to wrap up the session, otherwise we have a war for the cake. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for everyone participating after the lunch. Thank you. Yeah, just quick announcement. The Bernhard Harms Prize will start at 3:45 in the other big room. Yes, this will be the next point on the agenda.